So ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor to introduce to you River Spirit.
How do you call her? How do you say it? How do you pronounce her name? Anyone? Ah, there you go. You get a prize. Some people have called me Cootie, and others call me Coty. And please, don't call me Pithy. I much prefer Coty because Cootie, well, that's really kind of unpleasant. I'm sorry, I should introduce myself to you. I have surrounded you from the moment you entered West Chasco County. I am the spirit of the lovely Coty River. And thank you for coming to talk with me today. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. Now, in spite of my long name, I'm not very large. In fact, I'm only 23 miles long and not very wide. And if you compared me to the Mississippi, well, they'd say I'm just a baby. My headwaters are by Cruz Lake, up by the Hernando and Chasco border, and I flowed down into the Gulf of Mexico by Miller Bayou. I may be small, but I've had a large input in anything that's ever happened around here. In fact, the original groups and people came here to enjoy the river, to enjoy my fish and the waterfowl. And the native peoples that came, they too came because of my lush green plants, my abundant fish and wildlife. My name comes from the Seminole Creek language. Pilo means canoe or boat. Chaskita is to chop or cut. So there I am the place where canoes are made. You can see how important I was to the early native people in this area. But now, you all come for recreation, right? You just play on the waters and you splash around on my banks. And you know what? I like that. But don't you go leaving trash behind. You may have noticed many Indian names all around. Hundreds of them. We have a Apopka, Homosassa, Tallahassee, Miccosukee. You can't go anywhere without running into a place or a thing from one of our Indian names. Now, the first Indian tribe in this area was the Tokabega. The Tokabega, the name in the first Spanish colonial period, stood for a chieftain, a chief, and their major town. The primary town in this area was Safety Harbor, and if you've been there, you may have noticed a large mound that was made by discarded refuse and soil and shells and bones that were from the wildlife and the seafood that was their predominant diet. This was sacred to the Tokabega, and they erected a large enclosed structure on the top, which was either for ceremonial purposes and maybe even residence of the chief. Now, perhaps you saw a smaller mound along my mouth, the mouth of the river, of course, up by the Gulf. And this, too, was from the Tokabega, which was for ceremonial purposes. Well, unfortunately, what erased the Tokabega, their disappearance, was the same thing that erased many indigenous people. There was warfare, and there were diseases from which they had little to no resistance. Now, as many Indian names are in this area, the Tokabega was certainly not the only tribe that was here. In the 19th century, the Seminole began moving their way through Florida. Now, the Seminole was a mixed tribe. It was runaway slaves, it was Spaniards, and it was Creek Indians from Georgia. But then they began pillaging farms in Georgia. General Andrew Jackson then drove them south to an unknown and unexplored territory. Oh, my lands have been touched by so many hostile events. The Indian Removal Act, the Seminole Indian Wars, and the Civil War. During the Civil War and after, this town along this area was known as Hickory Hammock. And it was attracting businessmen. It was attracting settlers. And one that you may have known the name is Peter Bailey. You may have noticed a high pointed ground called Bailey's Bluff, but it's not spelled the right way for Bailey. But as you drive around in Newport Richey, you may have noticed Bailey Drive, which is spelled B-A-I-L-L-I-E, which is correct. I've heard many stories about how Bailey was able to acquire his coastal lands. Now, this one particular story was told by his grandson, David, that while Bailey was a surveyor on the Gulf Coast, and this was after the Civil War, by the way, he ran into a Toga Vega village that was at the north end of Tampa Bay. The chief was just stricken with grief. His only son was dying of malaria. Well, Bailey just so happened to have quinine on his possession for his own use, and he gave it to the boy. Well, as a reward, the chief took him to a high mount, and it was that mount I mentioned to you earlier. And with the sweep of his arm, they could see for miles, he gave all the land to Bailey. Well, that's one of the stories about Peter Bailey. It is true that Peter Bailey and another man named Samuel Hope were of the first people to bring their families and settle here. And are you wondering why isn't this called Newport Valley? Right? Well, in the 1880s, there was a small community named Hopeville. I guess they named that for Samuel Hope or one of his family, but in any way, people were coming. And I know you are wondering, what about Newport Richey, right? Just a little bit more history, a little bit more information to give you. In the 1800s, Florida was very sparsely populated. So to bring people in, the Armed Occupation Act of 1842 gave 160 acres of land to anyone who was settled here. Build a house. Well, I ask you, who would not want to build and live on this beautiful area? Certainly when they saw the river and they saw the beautiful land along my banks, right? And there was a sawworks nearby too. This was a perfect place for people to settle and to raise a family. And as an extra inducement, just south of here, they were selling 1 acre of land for 25 cents. What do you think a smart people will do? They buy low, they sell high, and it increases the population and the infrastructure. That was beginning the land boom. And are you ready for another history lesson? It's all in my diary. In 1881, Aaron McLaughlin Ritchie, there we go, he came to town to visit a friend who had already bought land, was living on the Gulf Coast. Well, when he saw the land along my shores, he thought it was perfect. What a great place to bring his ailing wife and to raise his children. So he negotiated with a man named Felix Sowers for his house, 76 acres and an orange grove that was at a point of land by my mouth, by the Gulf of Mexico. It was paradise. Well, not paradise because you see, they had plenty of food, they had shelter, but they were disconnected from the modern world. See, there was no road, and the only thing between the towns, you had to go by horseback to get your supplies. And the closest town was Tarpon Springs. So Richie thought, best way for me to get around is by boat. He went up to a boat builder, just north of here, up to Cedar Key. He bought himself a schooner. And when they asked him, what port are you going to register this boat with? What did he say? Port Richie. From then on, he was called Captain Richie, and the town of Hopeville was now called Fort Ritchie. He was able to get supplies for himself. He was able to get then supplies for his neighbors. So he then opened a small store in his house. And in 1884, he opened a post office. People were coming in, and soon, this entire area around this beautiful river, that's moi, was called Fort Ritchie. But it was still sparsely populated. In 1904, some wealthy businessmen from Georgia opened the Arapika sawmill, that's just north of here, and the timber industry was very productive. But then, of course, the timber's gone. So this opened for another enterprise. In walks a man named Peter Weeks. He buys the cleared land. He saw such amazing potential, not to mention that the river, but just 200 yards from the river was a pristine lake that we know as Orange Lake. He saw it as huge potential. So he starts the Fort Ritchie Company, which was for land development. With great foresight, he hired a manager, Mr. W.E. Guilford. And it was Mr. Guilford who laid out a map, and this map had a grid of streets. The streets running north and south are for presidents, and east and west are for states. Now, this was a planned community and full of potential. They knew that if they could just get somebody to come up and see this beautiful land and the river, the population would surely grow. So Mr. Guilford was advertising in northern newspapers, but he didn't have a lot of success getting people. He knew that Tampa was doing really well. They had a railway, and with the railway, it had a stop by a very luxurious hotel, and people were coming in, they were visiting, they were vacationing and spending their money. So Mr. Guilford thought, why don't we open a Fort Ritchie Company office in Tampa, which he did, and he still didn't have too much success. But change was coming. In 1912, Fred Sachs came into that office. He had left Missouri, and it was 5 degrees below zero when he left. He was spending 3 weeks looking for what he called the promised land. Well, Mr. Guilford was only so happy to bring him up to see this beautiful land. Now, mind you, it was only little dirt roads, and there really weren't very many buildings. But when Mr. Sass saw the land, and then he saw a half-built hotel, he was enchanted with the possibilities. And then he had a peaceful boat ride down which river? Chasco, of course. He bought the hotel, and he made it a mainstay in the community. He brought his wife to this newly formed town, and she was quite the hostess and quite the cook. In fact, before long, she was making dinners monthly, 35 popular dish was fish fry, of course. And where was that fish from? Of course. Well, they were not just entrepreneurs, of course. They were very community-minded people. So Mrs. Sass started the Port Richey Settlers Benefit Club. Well, Mr. Sass, he had his hotel. He made it a mainstay in the community, but he would be entertaining the guests from the hotel at Orange Lake, feeding a 9-foot alligator that he named Jack. People loved him. He would hold up the stick and Jack would jump up and grab the meat and but then Jack got a little big. And people weren't too thrilled about that. And we all know, if we're in Florida and there's a pond of water, there could be some alligators. Alligators or not, the town was growing and more people were taking an interest in the success of the town. Mr. Gerben DeVries came to the area, to Florida. He was recuperating from a long bout of malaria, and that's where he needed to go. He and his wife built a 2-room house on Central, just 2 blocks from the lake. They loved living in this very friendly town. And as he was feeling better, he really started taking an interest in the things he could do to improve the town. His interest was the postal service. Now, mind you, there were no roads between the towns. And his job was to get the mail for the Port Richey Company. So he thought, I'll row a boat. And are you wondering, I thought you just said we're in Port Richey, and why do I need to do that, right? Well, let's remind you that when Richey came, he was on the west coast, and he was just north of the river. And for convenience sake, he named everything Port Richey. Well, we are inland, just a little south of the river. And everything that was between the 2 areas was nothing but woods and thick undergrowth. So the only way to get the mail was going by rowboat. Well, he didn't think that was too big of a problem because he got to fish while he rowed the boat to get the mail. He was told he had to get 2 fish for every piece of mail. Well, the population started to grow, and that had to stop. But they thought, we need a post office. So he put out 2 petitions. One petition was for the post office. The other petition was, of course, to make him the postmaster. 80 people in the surrounding area signed the petition. Now, the Port Richey Company had worked so hard to establish its name, it needed to come up with another name for convenience. They needed to get the mail directly to the people. So they came up with the name of Newport. But the Newport they came up with was one word, Newport Richey. And did you know there's another Florida town called Newport, Florida? So then they changed it to Newport, 2 words. And there you have it. There you go. The town got another boost when the railroad came in. The Tampa Gulf Coast Railroad. People called it the Tug and Grunt. It was extended 6 miles from Elfers into Newport Richey, the downtown. This was its last stop before heading north. It had 2 stops a day, and when it came and the people got off, the whole town came and met them. You'd think they were having a party. Well, now that we were connected to the main street of Tampa, the movers and the shakers knew that we were headed for something really big. We soon built our first hotel, the Grand Rapids Hotel, and it was immediately enlarged and renamed Hotel Newport. We got our first newspaper. This is the first edition, January 1916. And before long, we had stores. We had the Newport Richie drugstore and soda fountain. It was W.H. Valentine's dry goods stores, J.W. Clark's meat market. Maybe you all know W.A. Casey's barber shop. And then, of course, Dr. Posey had his office as well. We built a 2-story schoolhouse right on Main that supported the other 4 schools in the area. And in 1917, we got our first fire truck. Now, our lanes were just muddy, but people were coming from the north. Wealthy people that could afford Henry Ford's Model Ts were making their way south to sunny Florida. I say we, because I am, and I always have been, an integral and inseparable part of anything and everything that has ever happened here. Oh, enough about me. Let me get back to all the marvelous things that were happening in our town. I mentioned automobiles to you, but our most common mean of transportation was horse and oxen. But we were starting to see these automobiles coming down, so our challenge was paved roads. So there was a national step to bring a highway from the far north to the far south, but each state was responsible for their part. Therefore, we made the Florida highway system. And it was their job to do their part of the Dixie Highway. Now, do any of you know that the Dixie Highway had 2 routes? Chicago to Naples and Detroit to Miami. You may not know it, but you may have actually driven on part of this on your way in, because I proudly got to pave part of the Dixie Highway from downtown Newport Richie to Elpers. Yes, this was the Dixie Highway on Grand Boulevard. Now, people were coming through this infant city. This led the path to the next step forward in our growth. Here's a name that I know you all know, George Sims. George Sims came from Detroit with his wife, Marjorie. He came looking to buy a winter home. He ended up buying the Port Richey Company as well as 14,000 acres along my bank. While he was busy working in town, Marjorie was motoring up and down the river, looking for the perfect place to build her house. George wanted his house in downtown, and well, we know who won that argument, right? Well, he was more than just selling home sites. Oh, he had an eye for something very special. Oh, I get so excited. I can't wait to tell you all how unique this was for our town that no other town had. Well, he knew that the fledgling motion picture industry was looking to move from cold northern locations to warmer climates. Now, Hollywood was becoming the predominant motion picture area, but you know, most of the people were living in the East, New York and Chicago. And in the 1920s, well, travel wasn't quite so easy. But he thought Newport Richie had as good a shot as any to become the Hollywood of the East. There were a couple impediments to this. One, we all would know this, is the high humidity. People don't like to work in it, and it made the actors' makeup run. The other was, well, we just didn't have the economic incentive for such a big business like making movies. It's true, we were having a land boom, but we just didn't have that infrastructure and that economic to bring such an expensive business such as making movies. But we did catch the eye of a couple production companies. And in the meantime, our infrastructure and community services increased. Our social and cultural underpinnings grew with the arrival of Dr. L. Roy Avery. Oh, what an amazing, educated civil servant. You know, he had been a teacher. He was a superintendent. He was a writer and an Ohio senator. He brought with him 1,000 books, of which he opened the first library and historical society. We were moving in the direction for all big things. We had more improvements, and there's so many for me to recall, but now, that's right, it was 1919. Burns Brothers came to town. They built the Goff Utility Company. This was a coal-fired steam engine electric company. And before long, we had lines, going in Edison's incandescent lights, just lighting everything up. The same year, they built an ice factory. And then the big one, the telephone came. How different and unique we were that no other town, small town like us had. We could connect the homes, the people, and the businesses. And then, at the intersection of Grand and Main, we built our first 3 brick structures. The first housed the Port Richey Company. The second was the first State Bank of Newport Richey. And the third, a 2-story mercantile building with 4 apartments on the top floor. Another important building was the Palms Theater. And it played silent movies every Saturday night. We were just on the path for such great things that even the Category 3 hurricane of 1921 could not derail. We were lucky. We only had minor damage, rooftops and sheds and barns. And when the things got cleaned up, the streets and just the little debris, the founding fathers of Newport Richey, Irvin DeVries, George Sims, and Dr. L. Roy Avery were determined to make us the gateway of tropical Florida. And you're going to really like this because in 1922, the city came to Mr. DeVries and said, we need a marketing plan. We need to bring people into this town. He needed only to look at Tampa, that had come up with an idea that brought thousands of people into the town annually. See, they had come up with a fictional tale about a pirate who attacked the city. And voila, what did they have? The Gasparilla. So he thought we could do the same thing. We could come up with our own rousing tale with pageantry. So we came up with a battle that was fought on my banks between the Indians and the Spaniards. Now, I'll mention that the Indian tribe he did choose was not one that was living in this area around that time, but that's another story. But the Chasco fiesta was started. So the tale went as he posted in the paper that there was an attack on the Spaniards and there were only 3 survivors, 2 of which were teenagers. Let's see, Don Felipe and Doña Isabella. They then changed their names to Pipla and Chasco. That became King Pipla and Queen Chasco. The town, the people got to vote for them, as many votes as they wanted, at a penny a vote. They then were crowned at the Palms Theater. They got to reign over the festival for the whole 3 days. That first Chasco fiesta was March 2, 1922. A parade down the boulevard. All of Enchantment Park was a carnival atmosphere. There were pony rides and food vendors and games. And around Orange Lake, there were car and horse races. It was so much fun. People were even dressed in costume, playing out this battle, and others just were in costume just for the fun of it. You know, it raised $1,000 for the Avery Library, and the Palms Theater was hosting burlesque shows and vaudeville acts, and they raised $400. To all concerned, it was a huge success. And do we think it's a huge success now? Yes! Did you know that this is one of the oldest city-sponsored festivals in all of Florida? And I must confess, I love seeing people on my banks. I love seeing people in my waters having so much fun. And did you know in that original fiesta that it was a combination of residents and visitors, and so many of those that were visitors came back with their families to be residents. Well, so much was happening, so many things were going. But the town realized that they couldn't keep going at this growth by just community-minded people and getting fundraisers and donations. They needed a formal government. So they did an ordinance that they would become incorporated, and that was 1924. Dr. Avery became the first mayor. They got a town clerk, a marshal, and it was 7 councilmen. The first order of business was to accept from George Sims all of Enchantment Park, all of its accoutrements, and even the wooden bridge over me. He changed the name to Sims Park to honor George Sims, who had done so much for our town. I think that was a pretty fitting tribute, don't you? Yeah. Well, there was so much going on that it wasn't long before people noticed there were some things that could be a little bit of a problem. See, there were no ordinances against having livestock or gators roaming around our streets. So they put up a fence around Orange Lake, and that took care of that, at least part of it. But there was a bigger problem. You know, there were a bunch of crooked real estate agents who were selling land sight unseen, and it wasn't as described. Florida was getting a horrible reputation, but you know what? Newport Richey had a good reputation, and the city leaders really worked hard for them to maintain that. And housing deals kept coming. But all that growth is good and bad. The city was then challenged. They needed to pave roads. They needed to add streetlights. They needed to add sidewalks. They added bridges. And they even extended Main Street, where over me, with a concrete bridge that replaced the wooden bridge. And then in 1925, they started a municipal waterworks complete with sewer system. Well, these amenities, these upgrades, were what was really attractive to those wealthy buyers. And other towns just couldn't keep up to that, which led us to the next step in our growth. You see, the wealthy northern elites that were coming south were business owners, industrialists, and at one time we had a bike maker, an automobile manufacturer, and then we had more real estate companies coming in to concentrate on those more affluent people. Now, our Palms Theater had been very popular. We would have all just loved it. But, you know, those wealthy people didn't like the wooden benches and the dirt floor, so they needed some upgrades. Well, George Sims, who had already done so much, got together with a group of other investors, and they formed a corporation which was called the Ritchie Amusement Company. Their sole purpose was to build a new theater that was going to be the pride of the city. The theater was built, and I can't tell you how amazing those next few years were. Oh, I just need to calm down. So let me share with you all of these things. See, Sims had been hanging out in Great Neck, New York, in Long Island. And that is where the Manhattan theatrical crowd was. See, we had built this beautiful Spanish theater. It housed movies and live performances. But we needed these people to come, so we thought, why can't we get these Broadway people, because so many of them were becoming movie stars in their own right, to come down to our beautiful home? Well, these guys really worked hard to sell the beauty of our town, and before long, the newspaper was saying, Broadway millionaires are moving, are buying home sites in our town, and of course, they were building on my banks as well. There were movie stars, there were producers, there were musicians, and in this first wave of celebrities was the very famous, very handsome, Hollywood leading man, Thomas Mann. He came with his brother, James, who happened to be a real estate agent, and you know, they thought they were getting in on something really special, and I think they really were. Other celebrities followed in suit, and they bought their home from James. When Thomas would walk down the street, all the ladies would swoon. He wasn't just a snowbird like we call our wintertime residents now. Oh no. He built a mansion on my West Bank. He registered to vote, and he made this his home in what he called the most beautiful and home-like city in all of Florida. There were so many more who came, just so many for me to mention to you, but perhaps you know the name of Gloria Swanson. There was Flora Zabel, Charlotte Greenwood, I think that was his sister-in-law, George Holland, in the music industry, Earl Benning and Irving Berlin, Paul Whiteman, who was, I believe, an orchestra leader, and oh yes, the big #1 movie producer was Sam Harris. I just can't name them all to you right now, I'm sorry, but it does seem that Sim's dream of making this the Hollywood of the East was really becoming a reality. Sports figures were awesome. when it was noted that the rich and famous enjoy some other activities, the Jasmine Point Golf Club was built. Well, Thomas Mahan called upon his friend, very famous golfer, Gene Sarazen, who helped to design the club and become its pro. He too built a place near Mahan on the water, and he planned on making this his home. See, the town was so good to Mahan, they even named the theater after him, so why not stay here as well? Of course, things were really happening, but there was a disaster that was looming in the whole country. I'll talk more about that in just a moment, but in the meantime, in the mid-1920s, great things were happening. Now remember, people had to stay in our hotels. Did you know we had 5? They were eating in our restaurants, they were shopping in our stores, and then we built more. And by 1929, we had 7 hotels, the grandest of which was the luxurious Hacienda Hotel. The Hacienda Hotel had groundbreaking in August of 1926 on land that happened to be donated by James Mahan. It was Spanish in architecture. But did you know that it had 50 rooms, each with private baths? This is in the 20s. Telephone, wall-to-wall carpeting, steam heat. There were 3 lounges in addition to the main salon. They even had rooms for workers that were not local. Courtyard on Main, terrace overlooking Sims. And contrary to popular opinion, the tunnel running from the hotel to my water wasn't for smuggling booze. It carried waste from the hotel to the river, as all the houses on the river did. And I wasn't too happy with that pollution of my beautiful waters, but oh, no worries, the sewer system is in a much better shape right now. In November, the hotel was christened Hacienda by George Sims' very good friend, very famous comedian, might add, Ed Wynn. And in February, the hotel opened its doors, first to the town people, and then for the rich and famous. They had banquets, and they had professional orchestras, and oh, what a success it was. Those rich and famous had it booked to near capacity in the winter, and half that in the summer. What a success. Do you know we were no longer thought of as a small, off-the-beaten-track little Florida town? They called us a beautiful resort destination. Good times kept coming. Good things were happening. Now, the land boom had pretty much ended for Florida in 1928, but Newport Richey was still booming. In fact, wealthy investors kept coming in. We upgraded. The Palms Theater was renovated, and the Mahan Theater added sound because of the talking. Sims Park added some outdoor venues and a dock leading out to me. There were some things that I really didn't like because they dredged me, expecting large yachts to come in the winter of '29. But for the golfers, they even added 9 holes. They were adding a clubhouse, a pavilion, and a casino. You can see things were really still booming in Newport Richey. But we all know what happened October 29, 1929. The stock market crash was not featured in our local newspaper headlines. It was still saying about the fabulous plans that we had for the winter season. Friends of the man's kept coming in, and there was even a rumor going around that MGM was looking at us as a filming location. But as the year went on, some things were happening that really got people worried. People were pulling out of their housing contracts. The city would spend money for beautification, and people thought it was a step of desperation and not the best use of their money. And then, Gene Sarazen won a huge prize, and he put his money in the New York bank, not our local bank. Depression was being felt in Newport Richey. But the city was able to stay afloat. It had to make some changes. Some city officials cut their salaries. They cut back some of the street lights. They closed the library. And then in the spring of '31, the real big hit came when our Newport Richey First State Bank closed. Not long after that, the Mayan Theater closed and the Jasmine Point Golf Club folded. Gene Sarazen, he cut his salary. He sold his home. And around the same time, Thomas Mann passed away. We lost two of our most famous ambassadors. The 1930s were really a tough time for me and our town. We lost our beloved citizens. And then Dr. Elroy Avery, the grand old man of Newport Richey, passed away, I might add, at the age of 91. But you know, our town was built on people. So it seemed like our lifeblood was draining away, and that we would never fulfill that illustrious task, that promise that we would have for this future. But don't you count us down and out, because just east of here, there's a beautiful lake that is made from my drainage basin. In 1933, a man named Ed Haley took Moon Lake. He was making it a full-stock hunting and fishing lodge. He wanted to attract the wealthy people that were staying at the hacienda. He wanted families that would stay longer, not just hunters and fishermen. So in 1936, he completed the Moon Lake Gardens and Dude Ranch. It had a grand lodge. It had cozy little cabins. It had riding stables. It had fishing piers. It had boardwalks. It had a casino, and of course, exotic gardens, various dining venues, and a dance hall. Well, the people that were staying at the hacienda were coming to stay. It was a huge success. And who do you think would build all it? Hundreds of people from Newport Richey worked in the construction, and then hundreds more in the service industry. It was amazing. But there was big trouble that was looming for our whole country. See, the combined depression and economic disaster for the entire country. Richey was no different. We went back to be a small, out-of-the-way, little Florida town until the retirees found us in 1970s. They found us to be a affordable, comfortable, and peaceful place to retire. In the influx of retirees was the very famous country music Carter family. Pop and Mother Maybelle bought a small little bungalow my mouth, the mouth of the river. They loved it there just so much. And when Mrs. Carter passed away, she left it to her daughter, June Carter, who happened to be married to Johnny Cash. See, we were still getting celebrities. They loved it so much for the 30 years that they were coming to visit their beautiful little cottage. And just before he died in 2003, they sold it. I was so sorry to see them go. But you know, all was not rosy in that 30 years that the Carters and Cashes were here. Oh no, we all know in the 70s, we had some poverty and crime. But here we are now in the 21st century, and we're experiencing a mini renaissance. In 2003, the city bought the hotel, the Hacienda, and I know there's been starts and stops and challenges, but they have been working to bring her back to the beauty of her inception. You know, we have new housing developments, Main Street Landing and the Central, that pay homage to our history. Downtown buildings now have restaurants, microbreweries, gift shops, and we even have a tea shop. And like the Hacienda with the Spanish architecture, we do have more. One such edifice is the Thomas Mann Theater, but you all know it as the Ritchie Suncoast. Thanks for some dedicated citizens who have been working to bring her back to the inception of the 20s. So do take a live performance in there sometime soon, please. Now you know the history of my beautiful town. Just take a ride down along my banks and see the mansions that still remain, that essence of that rich tapestry of our beautiful era. And if you happen to go up the river near the Carter Cash house, check just a couple of doors up to the mound left by the Toca Vega Indians 1,000 years earlier. Well, now it seems that we've come full circle. Do you know how to say my name? Pitlatches Cote. Pitlatches Cote. I hope to see you all again soon as you enjoy me and all the wonderful things my charming town has to offer. I would like to just mention Alma Bennett. Alma, where are you? Stand up. Where are you? Everybody's standing. Where is she? Alma. But Alma Bennett wrote this. She recruited me to do this and share it with you. It's been a great honor. Thank you all so much for choosing her to round of applause.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, Faith Bevan.
Oh, thank you. Oh, thank you.
And again, our playwright, Alma Bennett. And the flowers are being presented by the Sidney Gray, or Mrs. Sidney Gray, I should say, and Elaine